Yeah. Morning, Will Rose. All righty then. I think we're live. Although I didn't get the notice that we're on live stream. It says live. Hello, everyone. It's the 27th of July. God, time flies when you're having such fun. Welcome to Weekly Marx. Moved from Sunday because we decided that we were going to watch Class Unity on Sundays at 3 Eastern Time. And in that spirit, it is a course, as it were, on the crisis of 2008. However, it's proceeding, and like all discussions rather than courses, it veers back and forth, partially because it's hard reading. And last week, I think, was the week of trying to read volume 3 of Capital, which quite amusing, but problematic if you're into reading. Cliff Bowman's theory of Marx's theory of economic crisis is probably the best, one of the best written pieces on Marx. But what we're going to do today is probably catch up in a slightly different way, more orthodox. It is not what Class Unity was looking at, but rather the optional text, pages 169 to 178 of chapter 9 of Michael Heinrich's introduction to the 3 volumes of Marx's Capital. Now, I know that may seem boring to you, but it actually is quite explanatory. And considering Heinrich's own position in the history of Capital, and the fact that we're going to get another interpretation of Capital that's going to come out in September. That is an Americanized version, I suppose. All of these things are important. So therefore, I'm going to read chapter 9, pages 169 to 178. And it's quite readable, actually. I think Heinrich reads better in English than him yakking in German or English from a German. And I think that's a better thing, too. I think it's important also to read everybody's version of crisis theory because much ink has been spilled on the theory of capitalist crisis. And well, it should, because every time we have a crisis, we have commentary on it. That's, I think, why Class Unity wants to do it that way. And I think that that's really important because we've had another fix for the global economy. Because it could have all gone to hell in a handbasket. More likely, if Trump had been in charge in 2008, we would have really been in trouble. On the other hand, there would be 50 differentiated U.S. states, and we'd have a warlord in charge of each state, and it would be quite different. And well, anyway, we digress onto counterfactuals. Chapter 9, Cycle and Crisis, Heinrich 169 to 178. I put a link into the LibCom copy of Cycle and Crisis. Oh, no, actually, the link goes to the whatever the version is, which I think is the LibCom version for Class Unity on their server, but I'll put in the other link later for LibCom. Cycle and Crisis. Severe disruptions in the economic reproduction of society are referred to as an economic crisis. In a capitalist economy, this means that a large number of the commodities produced are no longer sellable. Not because there is no existing need for the corresponding products, but because there is no demand backed by buying power. Now, some of this is mediated by money, of course. That's my little aside here. Commodity capital can no longer be completely transformed into money capital. That's what I just meant. So that the advanced capital is poorly valorized and accumulation decreases. This whole accumulation thing is what's important about it. If it's not growing, it ain't showing, whatever. The demand on the part of capitalist enterprises for the elements of productive capital, means of production, and labor power, MP and LP, also decreases. Demand decreases. Mass unemployment and a decline in the consumption of the working class are the consequences, thus leading to a further decline in demand that further intensifies the crisis. That's the looming thing, and the thing that what Trump is trying to tell you, that there's mass unemployment, and in fact there's not, at least from a statistical level. The real numbers probably are much higher, considering a lot of people defected from the workforce during COVID, and some of that has not recovered. Although there are measurements for it, but I think they're problematic, and I'm not going to get into that story. Capitalism is not the only mode of production in which massive poverty exists alongside enormous wealth, but it is the only mode of production where a surplus of goods constitutes a problem. Unsellable goods lead to the ruin of their owner, while people who need these goods the most are unable to sell the only thing they possess, their labor power. The reason is that capital has no need for their labor power, since it cannot profitably make use of it. Ever since the early 19th century, when industrial capitalism became dominant in England and then in France, Germany, and the United States, crises occurred in the developed capitalist societies at roughly 10-year intervals. Periods of accelerated accumulation with high rates of profit and increasing wages were followed by stagnation and crisis, which ultimately culminated in initially slow and then accelerated recovery of accumulation. This is, you can see this in the sort of ebbs and flows of economies, particularly in the American economy, but you can see them globalized at a certain level towards the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. On the one hand, you'd have this accelerated growth of the American industrial economy, and then you'd have panics and other kinds of weird little crises, and they kind of lurch backwards and forwards with bank failures and a whole bunch of other crazy stuff. And this occurs before World War I. World War I helps fix some of those things. And then also, because of World War I and because of policies pursued after World War I, it gets worse. And then we get, Schicklgruber. In the 20th century, this cyclical development continued, but the cycles were increasingly less pronounced than before. The importance of super cyclical developments increased with the global economic crisis of 1929, a long period of economic depression set in that was only surmounted in the 1950s. Remember World War II. And in North America and Western Europe gave way to the long boom of the 1950s and 1960s, Make America Great Again, which rested on Fordism. This Wirtschaftswunder, capitalism brought not only high profit rates, but also full employment and an extension of the welfare state in the leading capitalist countries. In this phase, there was also still cycles, but without acute crises. The capitalism known to Marx, which was characterized by crises, unemployment, and impoverishment, seemed to have been transcended, at least in the capitalist metropolises, the metropoles. But this state of affairs changed fundamentally with the global economic crisis of 1974 to 75. The Fordist model of accumulation with its cheap methods of increasing productivity, that is Taylorism and mass production. Remember, Taylorism is, speeding up production, time motion studies, etc., assembly line production, had reached its limits. Profit rates declined, and cyclical movements increased in strength, although in periods of recovery, growth rates were modest and unemployment remained high. Profit rates recovered in the 1980s and 90s, primarily as a result of stagnating or declining real wages. Recall Reaganism and Thatcherism, as well as comprehensive tax cuts for businesses and wealthy individuals that were financed primarily by cuts in social expenditures. There can be no doubt that the course of capitalist development in the last 180 years was de facto marked by crisis. However, the answer to the question as to the causes of these crises is subject to debate. The majority of classical political economists, as well as contemporary exponents of neoclassical economics, would dispute that crises are a result of the fundamental mechanics of capitalism. That's the issue of Keynesianism. For classical and neoclassical economists, crises are caused by external influences, that is, state economic policies. But the capitalist market economy per se is free of crisis. Only John Maynard Keynes attributed recurrent mass unemployment to causes intrinsic to capitalism, thus laying the cornerstone for Keynesianism. This is about fiscal policy, and military Keynesianism is kind of part of that. In contrast, Marx attempted to prove that crises result from the capitalist mode of production itself, and that a crisis-free capitalism is impossible. However, one cannot find a comprehensive theory of crisis in Marx's work. Plenty of people looked for it, though, but rather scattered, more or less elaborated observations that have been worked up by Marxists into quite distinct theories of crisis. Bowman, whatever. With an analysis of money as a means of circulation, Marx had detected in the mediation of exchange by money. Money is a mediator, is media in another sense, the general possibility of crisis. One can sell one's own commodity without necessarily buying another commodity with the money thus earned. By holding on to the money, the process of reproduction is interrupted. Say's law, which claims that there is a necessary equilibrium between buying and selling, or that supply necessarily induces an equal demand, is only valid when the circulation of commodities mediated by money is equated with direct barter. Only then does each sale coincide with a simultaneous purchase. That's the impression we get from, tag sales or lawn sales or yard sales or garage sales or whatever, that's the real economy, when in fact it really quite isn't. Thus, when classical and neoclassical economics purport to substantiate the claim of inherent crisis-free capitalism, they basically assume a capitalism without money. That's how the Economics 101 is taught. They'll introduce Say's law, but then, sort of waffle about how it's not really explanatory. It must be explained how an actual crisis results from the mere possibility of crisis, why the chain of reproduction is interrupted. Of the various Marxist approaches, based on the law of the tendential fall in the rate of profit played an important role in traditional Marxism, the tendency for the rate of profit to fall. As a result of the falling rate of profit, the profit mass will also eventually fall, so that accumulation increasingly slows down and ultimately leads to crisis. So this little story gets told constantly. It's this, we're on the verge of revolution kind of thing, happens a lot. It is, the impulse for accelerationism, that is the fact that, well, if we push the system far enough, it'll crack, and then, revolutionary activity will kind of occur. And yes, that does motivate some people because, it makes you happier, right? To go out there, smash a few windows, it's got to fall. This apparently close tie between crisis theory and the law of the tendential fall in the rate of profit was usually behind the vehement defense of this law. However, Marx's decisive arguments concerning the theory of crisis are completely independent of this law. In the first volume of Capital, Marx had already identified the production of relative surplus value as a fundamental tendency of capitalist development, that is, decreasing the value of labor power by increasing the productivity of labor. The most important method for developing the productivity of labor is the introduction of increasingly improved machinery. This is the whole technical discourse, the transformation problem. The cost-saving introduction of machinery is mostly tied to the extension of the volume of production. An increase in productivity is therefore accompanied by an increase in the quantity of goods produced, which is further intensified by the necessities of competition. The need to be first to flood the market with goods, the need to anticipate the devaluation of the means of production by attempting the fastest possible exhaustion of their productive capacity by those Elmo dolls. The tendency for an unlimited extension of production confronts an ability to consume in society that is limited in a variety of ways, which Marx makes clear in volume 3 of Capital, hence the readings in the class unity course. The total social consumption is not limited to the individual consumption of end consumers, the final consumer. It consists in the consumption of the working class, the luxury consumption of the capitalists, and investments, or more precisely, the replacement investments that replace used up machinery, and the expansive investment through which additional means of production are acquired. That is, through which capital is accumulated. So, this is the cycle, right? It's a circuit. The consumption of the working class is constricted by the logic of capital valorization. That is, capitalists attempt to keep wages as well as the number of employed laborers as low as possible. Since for an individual capitalist, the wage is merely an expense factor, it's a cost. Under-consumptionist theories of crisis are based upon this constricted power of consumption of the working class. As an explanation for the existence of crises, the argument of excessively low wages and the resulting demand gap is insufficient. Wages are always lower than the total value of the product. This total value is equal to C plus V plus M, whereas wages are only equal to V. So, in other words, there's a gap there. Wages, whether high or low, are never sufficient enough to constitute the demand for the total product. This is that lag that I keep talking about. In addition to the consumption demand of the working class, there also exists the luxury demand of the capitalist, which is low relative to the total economy, however, so we can neglect it here. Finally, there is investment demand. This is the decisive variable. The demand of capital for additional means of production depends on it, as does indirectly the further development of the consumption of the working class, insofar as additional labor power is employed or not. Whether investments in productive capital, that is the means of production and labor power, MPLP, are high or low, depends on the one hand on the expected profit. If only a small profit is expected, then investment is held back. And on the other hand, upon the difference between the expected rate of profit and the rate of interest. These are all expectations. They're all built into the speculative investment. The individual capitalist, albeit not the capitalist class as a whole, always has the choice of investing his or her capital in productive capital or of employing it as interest-bearing capital. Investment in fictitious capital increases, timeshares et al., increases relative to investment in productive capital when interest rates are high or when expectations of a rise in share prices increase. And this is sort of, how the stock market sort of works. So capitalist production and capitalist consumption are not just differently determined, rather, their determining factors are downright antagonistic. A potentially unlimited production confronts a limited consumption, limited not in terms of human needs and desires, but the logic of valorization. And this is actually the important point, is that you have this logic rolling on, the so-called capitalist logic, and the actual necessity or needs, and they do not correspond. They are manipulated in a variety of ways. Oh, well, you need to have this, but you really only need to want that as opposed to needing it. The consequence is a tendency towards the overproduction of commodities, overproduction relative to buying power, and the overaccumulation of capital. Accumulated capital that either cannot be valorized at all or only very poorly. Your beer can collection, which ultimately leads to crisis. Reproduction stagnates, invested capital is devalued or completely wiped out, the least profitable production facilities are closed down, the least profitable individual capitals go bankrupt, workers are laid off, wages decline with the rise in unemployment. Crises are also enormous processes of destruction. Social wealth is annihilated, your 401k, and the living conditions of a large number of people worsen considerably. However, it's precisely these destructive moments that violently eliminate the imbalance between production and social consumption. This is this, Schumpeter talks about this, about the destruction in capitalism, right? Crises do not only have a destructive side. For the capitalist system as a whole, they're quite productive. The destruction of unprofitable capitals reduces production, and the devaluation of functioning capital and low wages increase the rate of profit for those remaining capitals. Ultimately, interest rates once again decline since the demand for borrowed capital also decreases. All these factors combine clear the way for a renewed upturn, which is often supported by the introduction of technological improvements. An increased demand for new machinery stimulates an investment in Department 1. Remember Department 1, the sector producing means of production, which is emphasized, of course, in Volume 1 and described in Volume 2. And as a consequence of rising employment, also increased accumulation in Department 2. That is the sector producing means of consumption, introduced in Volume 2. A new upturn begins that ultimately culminates in the next crisis. So crises are not just destructive. They are, creative, as Schumpeter says. Rather, in crises, the unity between spheres, such as production and consumption, that belong together but become independent of one another, this is the circuits argument, production and consumption follow different determinations, is violently restored. This is the antagonisms. Marx makes constant reference to the fact that crises perform a valuable service for the capitalist system, precisely by means of these acts of destruction. This is where Schumpeter comes in. And some people decide that it's a good thing. This is the Hayek version of this, or von Mises. Even if it's possible to figure out the mechanisms of crisis in general, crises themselves cannot simply be prevented. For one thing, the pressure of competition forces individual capitalists to engage in specific behavior, even if they know that this behavior is altogether destructive effects, but no individual can simply opt out. And the sole hope consists in emerging relatively unscathed. For another thing, the specific period of the cycle of crisis in which one finds oneself can never be determined with certainty. Is the economy still in a period of upturn, and will this continue so that an extension of production is still worthwhile? Or has the state of overproduction already been reached, and will it make itself felt in a sales slump? It is precisely the constant development of the forces of production through the introduction of new methods of production, that is technology, forced upon every producer who wishes to assert his or her presence on the market, that leads to a shift in demand flows. New branches emerge, old ones disappear or lose their importance. Machines and raw materials that were previously important are no longer so. Old enterprises are devalued. New ones emerge without certainty as to whether they will yield profits at the expected level. The only thing certain in this economic turmoil is uncertainty. The sole chance for surviving as a capitalist under such circumstances consists in using all possibilities for increasing profit, regardless of the consequences. Within capitalism, crises cannot be avoided, even if one can more or less figure out the developments that will lead to crisis. At the general level of depiction intended by Marx in Capital, nothing further can be said concerning the concrete developments of specific crises, even though a lot of people try to do that. The progression of specific crises is dependent upon the respective concrete circumstances, such as technical and operational developments, just in time, etc., the structure of the credit system, the position of a country on the world market, a priority for capital, particularly in times of crisis, the organization of the working class and its struggles, the manner of state intervention in the business cycle. This is not only true for the course of the usual economic cycle of roughly 10 years, unlike the Kondratiev cycle of 70 or whatever, but particularly for long-term supercyclical developments. At this point, we reach the limits of Marx's intended depiction of the capitalist mode of production at its ideal average. So 9.2, section 9.2, is there a theory of collapse? And there's a lot of ink spent on this. You really need to get a handle on this because, it does drive a lot of people's reasons for doing this or that, investing, not investing, running out and get your go bag ready, building your bunker, whatever. Because of their destructive sides, economic crises were often regarded in the classical workers' movement as an existential threat for capitalism. The possibility for economic crises leading to a crisis of the political system was conceived as follows. In the light of the difficulties of economic reproduction, political power relationships would lose their legitimacy and people would begin to rebel. In the early 1850s, Marx saw the revolutionary movements that shook Europe in 1848-49 as a consequence of the heavy economic crises of 1847-48. Somewhat hastily, he generalized this result and expected the next revolution to come with the next crisis. The following economic crises made it clear that there's no necessarily direct connection between crisis and revolutionary movement. Since the 20th century, at the very latest, we have learned that the insecurity brought about by dramatic economic crises can also provide a breeding ground for nationalist and fascist movements, right where we are now. In the history of the workers' movement, the notion that economic crises would ultimately lead to the collapse of capitalism, that capitalism was marching towards its final crisis, was widespread. Capital was interpreted as providing a Marxian theory of collapse. We can find this idea in the old German Social Democratic Party before 1914, in the work of Rosa Luxemburg, and in an elaborated form in the work of Heinrich Grossman, this I think in the 1920s. And in Germany in the 1990s, this old idea was revived by Robert Kurtz and the group Crisis. In the third volume of Capital, Marx speaks of the barriers of the capitalist mode of production, but not in the sense of a temporal end. A barrier should be understood here as a restriction. Capital develops the forces of production to an extent unknown in previous modes of production, but this development merely serves the small-minded aim of the valorization of capital. Unless you think this is unimportant, periodically during the Trump administration, Trump would pimp a rise in the stock market and then a fall. Ultimately, there would be a fall that because of pimping the rise in something or other, and then there would be a bunch of people running around somewhere. And though there was no direct connection, it was pretty obvious. You'd get a bunch of shorts on the market and people made some money. No one proved that empirically, but I'm fairly sure that probably did happen. The true barrier of capitalist production is capital itself. It is that capital and its self-expansion appear as the starting and finishing point, as the motive and purpose of production. Production is only production for capital and not the reverse. I.e., the means of production are not simply means for a steadily expanding pattern of life for the society of the producers. This is the theory of modernism, that jetpacks are on the way. Marx then speaks of a persistent conflict between the unrestricted development of the forces of production, that is, more machines, and the restricted capitalist aim. But there is no mention of a collapse of any sort. In only one single passage, this is the problem of some people reading all of this stuff and still not getting to the right answer. Not in Capital, but in the early Grundrisse, do we find a comment that could be interpreted as a theory of collapse. People ran with this. Marx notes that within the context of the increasing importance of the application of science to the productive process, it is no longer primarily the labor expended in the production process that is of significance, but rather the application of science, the general productive force. Marx thus draws the conclusion of a collapse of the whole mode of production resulting from these changes within the capitalist process of production. So this is Marx from the MECW, Marx Engels Collected Works. As soon as labor in its immediate form has ceased to be the great source of wealth, labor time ceases and must cease to be its measure, and therefore exchange value must cease to be the measure of use value. The surplus labor of the masses has ceased to be the condition for the development of general wealth, just as the non-labor of the few has ceased to be the condition for the development of the general powers of the human mind. As a result, production based on exchange value collapses. In his later works, Marx does not return to this idea from the Grundrisse. Remember, it's being written during a crisis. On the contrary, Marx implicitly rejected his former arguments for collapse. First, the significance of science for the capitalist production process is dealt with in many passages of the first volume of Capital, but the separation of the intellectual faculties of the production process from manual labor is not regarded as weakening the capitalist mode of production, but as a force for increasing the power of capital over labor. Second, the value side of this process, the fact that increasingly less labor must be expended in the process because you put in more machines, in the process of producing a single commodity, is not regarded in capital as a tendency towards collapse, but as the foundation for the production of relative surplus value. Marx, by this time, has figured out, oh, okay, well, there's other things that adjust within this thing, and relative surplus value is really where all the exploitation goes. The apparent contradiction that so astonished Marx in the Grundrisse, that capital striving to reduce labor time to a minimum, while on the other hand positing labor time as the sole measure and source of wealth, which is elevated by contemporary representatives of collapse theory like Robert Kurtz to a logical self-contradiction of capital necessarily leading to capitalism's collapse, is casually deciphered by Marx in the first volume of Capital as an old riddle, the riddle of political economy with which the 18th century French economist Quesnay had harried his opponents. This riddle, according to Marx, is easy to grasp when one considers that the individual capitalist is not concerned with the absolute value of a commodity, but with the surplus value or profit that the commodity brings in. This is the nuance. This is the gap between Grundrisse and Capital, and often which is interpreted to rationalize accelerationism because you saw in the early version, this is what he really meant. Well, that's not what he really meant. He actually changed his mind and also found other things happening. Labor time necessary for the production of a single commodity can decline. The value of the commodity decreases as long as the surplus value or profit produced by the capitalist capital increases. Whether the surplus value or profit is apportioned among a small number of products of high value or a large number of products with a smaller value is therefore insignificant. In other words, these little surplus value is dependent within this context upon certain other factors, including inventory and other kinds of circuits going on, right? I hope you can sort of see this. This is why supply chain becomes important. Even disregarding all the detailed objections, theories of collapse are confronted with the fundamental problem that they claim an inevitable, this is historical materialism at work, the fundamental problem that they claim an inevitable developmental tendency that capitalism is so unable to deal with that its further existence necessarily becomes impossible, regardless of whatever happens in the actual course of history. This is that difference. And you can interpret this in a variety of ways. And this is what the Frankfurt School was doing. Frankfurt School is going, well, I don't know. I mean, Hegel et al., it's kind of historical materialism sort of trundles forward. And, eventually capitalism it's all gonna screw up eventually. So therefore we shouldn't resist this rise in fascism. And that really is the problem. Some people go, well, no, it's just a flash in the pan. The people will come to their senses. Social democracy will defeat fascism at the ballot box. This Hitler guy, whatever. For the left, the theory of the collapse of capitalism has historically always had an excusatory function, regardless of how bad contemporary defeats were. The opponent's end was a certainty. To criticize such theories of collapse means in no way to defend capitalism, as some representatives of collapse theory maintain. Such a critic just aims to fight against capitalism without illusions that rest on badly founded theories. Ultimately, it is about theory. And so, thus endeth the lesson. And I end nearly on time. And please read this carefully, because you can see, as I've tried to indicate annotatively, the entire body of Marxist theory from the start to the Frankfurt School. This is kind of the issue. And a lot of people take it, where they need to take it for a variety of reasons. Rosa Luxemburg is trying to explain colonialism, neocolonialism, essentially, and imperialism. And, each person is trying to work through their kinds of issues, whether it's historical materialism, whether it's the importance of resisting fascism in all its forms, in all of its places. What's culture's role in this? That this is why people who are not so much soldiers, but writers decide they're going to fight for Spain, in 1936. These are really, a lot of people are invested in this in a variety of ways and interpret it in a whole bunch of problematic notions. Socialism needs to be developed in only one place and come to its full strength. Therefore, it will, conquer everything else. Or, why not have this integrated into other kinds of things like religion? So anyway, so that's the end of that. I'm almost pretty much to the end of the reading. I hope that you will read this, because in one single chapter, as I've tried to explain with my little asides, everything is pretty much there. All of the other little things that we worry about and that come up and that you may have encountered in a variety of political situations, and a certain set of issues that keep coming up. Why is utopian socialism so powerful at certain moments? Well, you see, at certain moments you have enough extra cash so that you can indulge the certain bourgeois tendencies. Let's go off and have our utopia somewhere, and in some cases it worked out. In other cases they generally fail. And the economy in general, it's not simply a revolutionary idea. Other people do it in other ways. I found these gold plates somewhere in New York State, and I think these are telling me to do something. And I think a lot of people are going west, so let's go west with our golden plates. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Please, you can talk. At 4:30 is Valleyvox, is my understanding. So there's a constraint on my yammering further, and we can all go escape over to Valleyvox.
At the beginning there, it talks about this decline in buying power, sort of as the, I guess it could be a measure of one of these crisis declines periods.
Yes.
And I was wondering, of that buying power, how much of it is labor power? What proportion of it would be coming from labor power?
Well, that's the difference. Is it labor power or labor? And that's the abstraction that you sort of need to figure out. And you can't, it's not possible at a huge macro level. It's really more regional. Now that's the whole point of David Harvey, is that you may experience a increase in productivity in certain places and a decrease in other places. And it's very uneven and problematic. So in one place where you're having a crisis, it may not necessarily indicate that we can have a full scale revolution or whatever. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I guess it sort of averages over regions,
yes,
and it can be uneven. That makes sense.
Right.
Yeah. So
that's what David Harvey.
Do we have
what? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Do we have a measure of this buying power? Is there some scale that shows relative buying power?
Regional CPI is a way of getting at that, but it's not. If you could have a division of if the divisions of labor at the state level weren't spending all their time distributing unemployment checks, I'm sure they could do an analysis of this. I'm sorry if that was sort of a obnoxious answer, but in fact, that's kind of what they're doing.
They're doing something else. They could be, but yeah. All
Um,
right. The other thing I was thinking of was, I was trying to think of examples of how that destruction happens, and this idea of, Elon Musk buying Twitter for 45 billion, and then it sort of is no longer worth quite that much. Is
but he
that
gets
some of
paid
this
back.
destruction?
He gets paid. He gets paid back. Remember,
Okay, so, somebody gets screwed, not him.
somebody's getting screwed somewhere, right?
Okay.
Right, because he got it all back in this last whatever executive increase in his salary or whatever.
Right.
I think he got it back with interest, which was even scarier.
Now I can spend it on political campaigns. Yeah, and that was kind of another question I had is, I guess this excusatory thing that, the left is depending on capitalism to fail, and it's not happening. But what is happening is, this like political, I don't know, like Trump coming to the fore more. It seems like, maybe one of the consequences of this, rather than, revolution, is that we just head towards fascism kind of thing.
Exactly, exactly. I'm sorry to say that, but and it's sort of cold in the sense of Holocaust and everything. But what is it that we get at the end? We get military Keynesianism essentially at the end of the World War II.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah.
I mean, you only see this in retrospect. You have all these other expectations, and in some ways it's fulfilled. I mean, needless to say, and that's the Maoist argument that you had all this shit, but eventually, you got China, whatever.
All right. Yeah. Yeah. Another good
I mean,
example, right?
that's the hope and expectation of MLM, Marxist Leninists, Maoists. It's a kind of post-Stalin Stalinism or whatever, however you want to interpret it. It's got all these issues. Single party state, blah blah blah. Whatever. I think it's easy to analyze stuff in that way. I mean, there are plenty of other contradictory or problematic arguments, but I like thinking of it that way. You have all this, you have smaller, lesser minds sort of thinking, oh, this is revolution's coming. And sort of, no, it's not coming. You're going to can't have the constant illusion that it's coming, but it never comes. We're eating turnips, waiting for Godot, whatever.
Oh my.
I mean, I think there is an existential crisis of democracy, but it's an existential crisis of social democracy. If you're thinking accelerationist sort of things, if you believe that the left will succeed in a counter revolution or a revolution created by the right wing, I think you're fooling yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, and none of this is going to happen by magic. It's
Oh no, oh no, no. It's a lot of things have to change though, and this is that the ultimate conflict of, well, we have to have critical mass if we're going to, and it's a chicken and egg problem. Uh, if we create enough street violence, maybe it'll happen. It's a 19th century model. It's a good one, but a lot of other things have to happen, and I don't think you can ensure all those things. And in fact, the right wing was sort of trying to do that. Right, January 6th has that model built into it. Right.
yeah, I didn't really think of it that way until just you saying that. Huh.
Oh, they did. It was all there, right? You would have a J6 replicated in every state capital. Seriously. and then Insurrection Act, and then martial law, blah, 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 right? It's all there.
Yeah, like after the fact, you can kind of see where they were trying to organize that, right?
Exactly. And it's not a conspiracy theory. I mean, it's an actual conspiracy.
Yeah, all those court cases.
All those court cases, right? And standing down the entire military for 24 hours is actually a good idea, because otherwise you'd have this little, oh, well, there's this cadre of neo-Nazis who are in X division at X camp somewhere, pissed off that their camp got renamed, and they're going to get, whatever. Yes, multi-level marketing revolutionaries. Far too often is that religious cults are MLM active. They do indulge in MLM activities. It's not just selling flowers at the airport, but it's a bunch of other things. Anyone else?
So if the January 6th model is not the model for the left, what it is?
Well, I mean, it does default to a more social democratic kind of thing. Peaceful means in that to move left. Yeah, I kind of in America that would be kind of the thing. I don't know. I mean, I'm not gonna, otherwise that makes me the next whatever. No, I'm not into that. The next demagogue, but I'm not that person. I think in high school I was that way, but
I mean, this is sort of the Bernstein model, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
I think we've seen from the Democratic Party. I mean, they weren't even going to allow Bernie, who's a very mild social democrat, to be elected president and to have a possibility of implementing some reforms that would give our economy, I think, staying power, give our society the ability to continue while allowing the rich to keep almost all of their money.
Darn that Medicare for all.
Yeah. I mean, that was too much for them.
Exactly.
So I don't know. I don't see a lot of hope in the Bernstein model.
I don't either, but you kind of, there is, we have faith, I suppose, of one kind. I mean, it's a lot less lethal to do it that way. But the fact is, history will intervene anyway. I mean, history's going to intervene. I mean, we have nuclear weapons. What are we going to do about them? Are we going to actually turn them off or aiming them in a different direction is not the same as turning them off or destroying them. But that's what happened.
That's for sure. Well, I mean, it really, I don't know if we did aim them in another direction. We've resurrected the Cold War with Russia.
Indeed, we did. Indeed, we have.
And we had the lesson of history to say, okay, you don't do what you did to Germany after World War One.
No.
Because you get a big problem after that.
Indeed.
Right? And that's what has happened with Russia.
But yeah, but
we destroyed their economy.
Yeah, but they did it themselves, and they're not that.
No.
They're not that bad off. They had a huge surplus before they started that war, and I mean, not including the money that we've seized.
I'm not talking about from 2014 or 16 or whatever. I'm talking about from 1991.
Oh, yeah, okay. But that has a whole bunch of other historical variables, like 1994, when, they gave the missiles back, whatever. We denuclearized Ukraine. It'd be a lot different if Ukraine had nukes right now.
Yeah, but I think at the time we did the right thing because the fewer countries that have nukes, the better, from my perspective.
Yeah, but they broke the promise though, didn't they? Right in 2014.
Yes, but a whole bunch of other things happened in the meantime.
Oh yeah.
When the United States made it clear that they're not going to allow Russia to have a sphere of influence. And in a world system where you have powerful countries that all claim a sphere of influence, you said to Russia, no, not on your border. We control the world. So shut the fuck up and listen to us. We run the world and you're nothing.
Darn superpowers.
What a surprise that they didn't like that.
Darn hegemony.
I mean, what do you think was going to happen? First, you destroy their economy by sending people over there from Harvard to introduce shock therapy into their system, which created a depression far, far worse than the Great Depression in Russia. And you supported a drunk for leader who was totally compromised and was essentially an agent of the U.S.
Yeah, Boris.
Boris Yeltsin, yes. And you don't think the people of Russia are going to react to that? Can you imagine if that happened to the United States? I'm sure the world would already be vaporized by nuclear weapons.
We sort of are doing it, but anyway.
Yes, I think this is overlooked. People have to look at the long arc of history. And
oh man,
it's not as simple as Vladimir Putin's a bad guy and he invaded Ukraine. Yes, both of those things are true. But what brought him to that terrible decision?
Well, there are other things that went on, of course, right? I mean,
yeah.
Putin, staged his own internal coup in terms of the oligarchs, right? He wiped out the oligarchs who were against him and got most of the oligarchs on his side.
Right. Which, I would suppose any non-democratic leader would do in order to remain in power or to have the power necessary to fight back against a world system that is trying to essentially make Russia into what was proposed by one faction after World War II for Germany, which was to deindustrialize Germany or never allow it to industrialize again, not allow it to have a military, and essentially be a country of farms.
Well, but the history shows that really didn't happen,
No, it didn't happen, but it was proposed.
Oh, yeah.
And I think what's gone on is that the US has chosen a modified version of that for Russia. And Russia was not going to agree to that. They were not going to say, oh, yes, here, all of our resources are yours for the taking at whatever price you care to pay. Like the US has done in the Middle East, or it's tried to do in the Middle East, as it has done in Central and South America. That's what the plan was.
Yes.
And Russia said, no, I don't think we're into that. And I don't think they can be blamed.
No.
Would any country allow that to happen to themselves if they could push back?
Well,
Do we have a cold and hot war now?
yeah,
We do. Yeah.
several hot wars, or almost hot
Yeah.
wars.
I was amused when Biden said we're not at war. Well, I guess depends on your definition. We're certainly involved in proxy wars.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, 10 Israelis have just been killed in a football pitch in the Golan Heights via rockets.
There you go.
It's just
Where were the rockets coming from?
well, they're blaming Hezbollah.
Yeah, there we go.
Nobody's
That
confirmed.
comes just on the back of the Israelis bombing a girls' school in Gaza. 30 killed and over 100 injured.
Tit for tat. That's
Darn
what's
those
happening.
human shields.
What do you guys make of? And I watch Electronic Intifada, and they're, the stuff that they bring is like, film from, I guess, Hamas militants that show them being effective against, Israeli tanks and stuff like that.
The resistance.
Yeah.
What about it?
What do you guys make of that, that there is media that shows that? I'm sort of surprised. It's like,
Well, there's plenty of plenty of the other side being shown.
yeah, that's what I'm used to. Yeah. And so I'm like surprised there's even a little bit, and this is pretty provocative, I think, to that, status quo. One of their reporters was just, talking about how Germany, if he goes to, Germany has, done a court case, I guess, to, convict him of violating their, whatever their free speech or something like that. So that if he does go to Germany, they'll probably arrest him.
Yeah. That he wasn't even able to speak on the Zoom from a
Well, it wasn't a
completely
Zoom,
different country.
It was,
or
YouTube
video
broadcast.
online, whatever. Yeah.
Well, thank you, everyone. Well, we should shut off the live stream, and because other things are going to happen. Class unity tomorrow, and then more this and that on Monday.
Woohoo! Thank you.
And can you take over host and kill the YouTube?
Yes, I can. Please.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Still live.
Yep. Oh, come on. No one wants to. Have their comments preserved for perpetuity or whatever.
What's happening? You're trying to stop the YouTube?
Yeah, we're doing that. I have not been yet reassigned, as they say.
No, you have to take it back. Or you can't.
I can't take it back. You have
you'll
have to assign.
Okay. Let me see. Hmm. Let's see.
Once
Yes.
again, the tech overlord prevails.
Yes, the surfing competition is in Tahiti.
Yes, that was good. The opening ceremony.
I mean, where are you going to get any decent surf anyway? Off of France. Oh, well, no, you're still Joe is still